Vacation is always nice, but there's always coming home feels so good. Especially this time. Not that we had a bad time, we had a good time. And it does feel like a long time that we've been away. And yet, I walked in here and it felt like it was yesterday. So it's good to be home. So we went on vacation to North Carolina. We had a beach house that we rented, and we thought it would be a great idea to rent an RV and take an extra week and drive down. Now, I've never driven an RV. And when we rented it, I thought it was a 28-foot RV. We found out it was a 33-foot RV. Never done that before. And the rig handled better and easier than I thought. I was pleasantly surprised. Yet I can tell you that for several months, I was nervous. I was nervous about it. In fact, I talked with Keith several times, and I said, I'm a little nervous about this. Okay, I use the word concerned because it sounds better than nervous, right? When we first picked it up, I started driving it, and I thought, on 87, coming down from Kingston where we rented it, I thought, this is not too bad. I can do this. And in fact, we came into into Cortland Manor, and I was going to take some main roads to get there, and I said, I'll take the back road. And it was narrow, and I was feeling pretty good. And as we packed it up, all 7 of us, all 5 kids, Margaret and I, and our 2 big dogs, we drove down to Delaware. No problem. And we pulled into my father-in-law's, my in-law's driveway, and that's where we stayed the night. And I'm thinking, not too bad. I can do this. I'm feeling pretty good. The next day we traveled mostly by big highways, nothing too narrow. It wasn't a bit difficult. We camped at a particular campsite for a couple days. Unfortunately, the second day out, we had one of the dogs on a leash. They decided to go that way. Margaret was walking this way, and she fell over. And it was like, you ever have like a slow motion moment where I'm sitting there and I'm watching her go over, and it's like, no, but I couldn't get there in time. And she went right over, and immediately I knew she was hurt. In fact, the boys had been walking down to go to the bathhouse, and I yelled, "Come here, Whitney!" And they came and grabbed her and picked her up and brought her into the RV. And I felt horrible for her, especially on the second day. Now, at that point, we thought, okay, maybe this is just a small sprain, it'll be okay. It wasn't okay. It wasn't okay. So she hobbled around the rest of our vacation, but we camped on the way down there, and everything went, for the most part, pretty well. I was a little nervous on some of those narrow roads getting to the campgrounds that we camped at, and I felt so bad for Margaret and her foot, and the fact that she had to hobble around. But then we had to drive back. We had a wonderful time on the beach. But when we had to drive back, and I must admit that after the first day of driving back, I wasn't really thinking too much about Margaret's broken foot. I was nervous because there were narrow roads and the highways had construction on it.
Yeah.
And so the median was right at the white line, and I had to drive down. And then Margaret decided that we're going to go over, and she's wonderful. If you ever need anybody to like coordinate your vacation and stops, she's the one. And we went over the Chesapeake Bridge. Well, those are pretty narrow roads when these 16-wheelers are whizzing by going 70 miles an hour, because I'm only going like 55. My tension in my shoulders was excruciating, And I kept going, and my daughter's sitting in the next seat. She goes, Dad, what's wrong? I'm just nervous. I'm just nervous. And then we get on the Garden State Parkway. And the Garden State Parkway, again, construction. And these tractor trailer drivers whizzing by. And then it dawned on me, this is Labor Day. This is Labor Day. So we had all the Labor Day. And it was brutal for me. Not for anyone else. For me. And of course, I didn't say, I'm really nervous. Let me pull over and rest here a bit. And my shoulders were just burning. So we finally get home. And I have to admit, the whole way home, I felt bad for Margaret, but I didn't think about her foot too much. I was just, oh shoot, I have to drive again. That's really, on the way back, that's what fell into my mind. Margaret can't drive. I have to drive the whole way. Because you have to be over 25, none of the boys could. Otherwise, I would have had them up there. And so we get home, and we unpack everything. And then I have to drive it back to Kingston, to where I rented it. No problem. Get on 87, I'm going 50, 55, no problem. But by that point, it was ingrained in my mind, and the tension in my shoulders was just, it was just burning. I finally got it to the guy's house that we rented it from, and pulled over, and when I got into my son's car to drive back home, I got home, I felt like a new man. Now the funny thing is, I was writing this down as an introduction on Thursday. And as I'm writing it down, my shoulder is starting to burn. And I'm thinking, what in the world is going on? I'm reliving all the tense. But you know what? It's my experience. And it was filled with some really great memories. And it was filled with some really nerve-wracking times. But it's my experience. You might not have felt that way. I did. That's my experience. I don't understand what it's like to have a broken foot and go through vacation with a broken foot. That's not my experience. That's Margaret's. Now, nobody can say, I know just how you feel. And by the way, that bothers me when people say that. You don't know how I feel. We don't know how someone else feels because we don't have the same catalog of experiences or personal history. So when we say, I know just how you feel, no, you don't. We have experiences, all of us. Some are blessings, some don't feel like blessings. Some are good, some are bad. Would I do an RV again? The macho part of me says, sure. But I'd be nervous. I'd probably be a little nervous. But you know what? I have the experience, and the experience taught me a lot. I know I can relate to what it's like to drive something like that. I understand. But I don't understand anybody's personal experience because it's different for you, just like it's different for me. But I'm going to remember the lessons that I learned. And remembering is really important when we're talking about experiences. The first part of Job 10:8 is the verse that we've been using, or I've been using as a theme for your shape. S-H-A-P-N-E. E is what we're covering today. We're going to cover it next week. Experiences. What is your God-given shape? I know we've been away from it for a few weeks, but Job 10:8 says, you formed me with your hands, you made me. For weeks now, as we've been going over it, I've mentioned several times that you and I, we were shaped for significance. We've been talking about how God makes every person individually unique through a series of 5 different things. S is God has given you spiritual gifts. The moment you accept Christ as your Savior, you're giving a spiritual gift or gifts. It's up to us to discover those and begin to utilize them. He's gifted us to do things that other people can't do. Now He's given us a heart, that's H. A heart, a motivation, a desire. There are some things that just turn you on, and there's some things that turn you off, and it's different for every person. We have a heart, a God-given heart, a passion for specifically what He's designed us for. And then we have natural A, abilities. Abilities. Some of us have the abilities to work with things or people or animals or words or numbers or athletics. We all have different kinds of abilities for a purpose. And God has given you a P, S-H-A-P, a personality. We're all unique with different personalities. Some of us are great at organizing, at planning a trip. Others of us, okay, what do? Where do we go? We're different. Our personalities are different. We're unique and different for a purpose. And today and next week we're going to wrap up because we're going to be talking about E, experiences. And experiences are really, really important because it includes our shape. God has customized the experiences you've had to make you, you. Your experiences have shaped you. All of us operate on what Rick Warren calls a personal referral system. It's kind of like a data bank of memories and experiences that you stockpiled in your mind. And every time you see something, or you feel something, or you hear something, you immediately attach it to some frame of reference and you think or you say to yourself, does this jive with my experience? Does this agree with what I've experienced in the past? Does this correlate with what I know to be true? For instance, if I were to say to you, parenting is easy, some of you would laugh and say, no, it's not. And some of you might say, yeah, it is. If I were to say to you, high school was fun, some of you would say, no, it wasn't. High school was brutal for me. Maybe you can partly agree with that experience. Well, there was some fun in it, but no. If I were to say to you, crime doesn't pay, a lot of you would say, absolutely, I agree with that. But there might be somebody that says, actually, that's not my experience. Crime was pretty profitable for me. I found it to be, I made a lot of money doing wrong things. It's just different. We've all had different experiences, and those experiences bring about this personal referral system in our mind and in our hearts. You've been shaped by many different experiences. Some of them were your choice, but many of them were way beyond your control. There are family and relational experiences. Obviously, people have a tremendous influence over our lives. People say, you're just like so-and-so. Well, they're basing that off of their experience with that particular person. You might think, no, so-and-so's a jerk. Based on your personal experience with that person. You saw them differently. There's educational experiences, the schools, the books, the seminars, the training that you've gone through that has helped to shape you. There are spiritual experiences, meaningful times with God. Some of us cry during worship time. Some of us don't. It's based on personal experience. There are certain words that catch me as we're singing. And I focus on those words, and it brings up all kinds of emotions. Those experiences have and do shape us. All of these. Vocational experiences, your career, your job. Crisis experiences. Experiences that are tough and they hurt. All of these, even the painful experiences, have shaped you, and that's the way God designed them for you. It's why in my mind, again, that when I see somebody say, I know exactly how you feel, no, don't say that. I can relate to what you're saying, but I have no idea what you do. We don't. Only God does. Remember the story of Joseph in the Bible? He was a man who everything went wrong for him the first half of his life. He was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was taken to a foreign country. He was sold to his master. He was falsely accused of rape. He was put in prison. His life was all downhill the first half of his life. Yet years later, in Genesis 50:20, he says to his brothers, when he was reintroduced to them, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. God has a personal plan for your life. For my life. God made you for a purpose, and He has a plan for your life. And He has also uniquely designed experiences for you, which are both personal and purposeful. God has a purpose in these experiences that you've encountered. So what are the purposes? 3 intentions that God has created these experiences in your life. First, John 13:7. Jesus is speaking. He said, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Most of us understand what he's talking about here. Hindsight is 20/20. Usually perspective comes after the fact rather than during the experience, right? Usually it's a lot easier to look back on life and say, oh, that's why that was happening. That's why that was taking place. That's why those experiences were entered into my life. But at the time, we don't know. We're not sure of the lessons or the benefits. Often you don't understand them when it's going on. But God says, you don't understand right now. And that's what Jesus was saying in this passage. You don't understand right now. Maybe, but you're going to eventually understand why these things happened in your life or happen in your life. If you've ever wondered, why is this happening to me? You're normal. And I hope you'll take notes, take them home, file them away, because someday you're going to say, why is this happening to me? And you can pull them out and remind yourself. Remembrance is such an important thing. So, God says He intentionally plans experiences in your life for 3 reasons. Number 1, they are intended to teach me to trust God. Number 2, they are intended to build my character. Number 3, they are intended to accomplish God's purposes. The Bible says very clearly that the experiences that come into your life are not random. They're not by chance. They're not freaks of nature. There's an intentionality behind it. And there's a purpose behind them. So let's go to the first point. To teach me to trust God. 2 Corinthians 1:9 says this. This happened so we might learn to trust not in ourselves, but in God. That's Paul speaking when he was in prison. You know, you're never going to know that God is all you need until He's all you have. Sometimes God has to knock the props out from underneath you and me, and everything falls flat, and things don't go the way you wanted them to go, because you'll never know that God is all you need until He's all you've got. Over the past few weeks, I've ventured into the book of Revelation during my daily Bible reading. And one of the themes that keeps coming out over and over again is the importance of remembering. Remembering is actually a very important theme throughout all of the Old Testament and the New Testament. In fact, we remember every week when we celebrate communion. Remembering is important. What do we call? Yesterday, we saw it all over the place. To remember and never forget 9/11. 20 years after the fact, and still our own damaged society is calling on us. Our own damaged society is calling us to remember and never forget. They understand the importance and the power of remembering. We're called as Christians to keep remembering what God has done in the past in your life. Remembering where you maybe once were with Him, but maybe you aren't now. Or remembering what your life was without Him and what your life is now with Him. Remembering your experiences, both the good and the bad, and how God has blessed you through them and how He's brought you through them. Because remember, God doesn't ever waste a hurt. Even when we are most down, He's there with us. He's promised to never leave us or forsake us. But what's the key to that? Trusting Him. It's a really simple little phrase, trusting Him. It's a phrase that we're constantly tripping over, aren't we? And this has been a theme also in my reading. Dependence upon God through good and bad experiences is the key. And remembering plays a big role in it. And dependence is a tough thing for us. And after all, we're Americans. We're independent. We can pull ourselves up through our bootstraps. And whoever came up with that phrase anyway, I don't know how you do that. I think there's a big reason why our ancestors wrote on all of our money, "In God we trust." And I think that's going to be a key element in all of our lives as we remember our experiences and come to a place of dependence on God and His plan. And let Him work instead of trying to do it ourselves. If I asked you all to write down the greatest lesson you learned in the last year, I'll bet many of you would speak to that basic theme. God is in control and I'm not. I need to trust Him. Rick Warren, he asked that question of his congregation years ago, and here's a few of the answers that they came up with. The greatest lesson is that God will take care of me and provide for me if I trust in Him and stop trying to control my own life myself. The greatest lesson I learned is trusting God to take care of me really works. The greatest lesson I learned is that letting go and letting God is a daily choice that I must make, and when I do, He works mightily. The greatest lesson I learned is that God is faithful, and you can count on Him. The greatest lesson I learned is to relax, trust God in all areas of my life, spouse, work, children, family, friends, and future. The greatest lesson I learned is that as my husband served in the Gulf War, I learned true trust in God. God allows experiences to teach you and I that He is trustworthy. That's the first thing. Second thing is to build your character. These experiences allow you to build your character. You don't grow character by reading about it. Joshua shared a little bit about that. And I know that because I tried it. It doesn't work. You grow character by experiencing it, by making the right choices when you're tempted to do the wrong thing. Romans 5:4, it says, "We know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character. And character, hope." Probably want to circle character there. Suffering actually builds character in our lives. The experiences that are there, they're there to teach you and I character. For instance, the character quality of integrity. Integrity is learned when you do the right thing, even when doing the wrong thing is much easier. Endurance is learned when you keep on keeping on, even though everything in you is saying give up. Responsibility is learned when you keep your commitments, even at personal cost, because you said you would. Proverbs 20:30 says, "Sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways." We don't like to hear that, do we? We don't like to hear that. It's true. When God turns up the heat, then we change. How many of you, as a parent, maybe you told your children, don't touch the hot stove? Maybe you were told that by your mom or dad when you were growing up. Did you touch the stove? Probably. How many of us had children that we said, don't touch the hot stove, and they went ahead and touched the hot stove? It's kind of like you don't want to say don't, because if you say don't, they're gonna. Right? Here's what I'm learning. Each generation must learn the stove is hot. Some things, the only way you learn it is by getting burned. Some of you learned some tough lessons this last year by getting burned. Sometimes all the good advice in the world doesn't get you through, and some things, the only way you learn it is learning it through an experience. Sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways, to build our character, and thirdly, to accomplish God's purpose. We have to get this in our head. We have to remind one another of it. We have to remember it. We have to make it a mantra that we're saying all the time. There's always His purpose behind it, not ours. For instance, Paul was a prisoner in Rome. He was taken prisoner falsely, handcuffed, in a shipwreck on the way to Rome. He was jailed in a dark dungeon jail. He was chained to a Roman soldier 24 hours a day. And one of Caesar's own guards was chained to Paul 24 hours a day. Yet in spite of it all, he said in Philippians 1:12, whatever has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. He says, yes, it's tough on me right now, but there's a greater purpose behind it. And what's the greater purpose? What was the greater purpose? One thing is, he was able to witness to a captive audience. They couldn't leave. They had to hear him. They had to hear him talk about Jesus. So, history tells us that in a matter of a few years, there were actually members of Caesar's own family who had become believers. How do you think that happened? Where did they hear about him? From the guard who was chained to Paul, who heard the gospel. So Paul said, what happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Joseph, again, he had to go to prison in order to become the authority in Egypt, to save his family, his people, Israel, to bring salvation to them. And some 400 years later, through an 80-year-old guy named Moses delivers the nation of Israel to the promised land. You know what? Some of us, we need to read our Bibles, because some of us, we feel like we're old and we're done. God isn't done with you yet. You're here. There's purpose behind that. When you're done, He's going to take you home. But until that time, we've got a job to do. We've got a purpose. You're here because God still has a role for you to play, a purpose why He hasn't taken you home. There are many experiences in your life that you're not going to understand here on earth. You're not going to know why they happen until you get on the other side of eternity. When you get to heaven, when you get home, it's going to make sense. But until then, we have to become dependent upon our God. Tough thing. In the meantime, whether you can figure it out, why it's happening or it's not happening, we need to learn to make the most of our experiences here and now, to get the best of them. We'll talk about that next week, but for now, for this week, let's take a good look at who we really trust. trust? Who do we really depend on? Jesus died so that we could depend on God, have a relationship with him, know his Spirit, to love him with all our heart, soul, and mind. And that's the first greatest commandment. And you know what? When we love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, what flows out of us is loving our neighbor as ourselves. And isn't that interesting? It flows out of us. As we look forward, it's the cross. It's the cross. That made it all possible. He loves us, he is faithful to us, and he can't pour out all he has for us when our hands are so full with our own stuff. So we need to trust that he's in control, even when we're not. We need to trust that these experiences are happening because he has ordained them. He has provided them. He has a greater purpose than we can ever imagine behind them. Believing in him is a mind thing. Trusting him is a heart thing. And you know what? He wants both of those. Our mind and our heart. That's why he died. So that we could remember. It's why we celebrate him. To remember who we're dependent on. Because we forget so easily. As we have some gentlemen come up and share the elements, think about where does your dependence